Hello and welcome to another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. Today we'll be speaking with Thomas B. and learn what it was like for him getting sober in New York during the 1970s. He'll also tell us about an interesting conversation he had with Bill W.'s secretary, Nell Wing. We'll talk a little bit about the history of the Back to Basics movement and the prospects for a Grapevine Book with stories from atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers in AA. I hope you enjoy the program. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to talking to you. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I've read some of what you've written online, and you have a really interesting life. You've lived through some interesting times.
Yeah, it has been interesting.
Yeah, much more so than mine.
A first point of view and a general point of view.
So I always start these conversations by asking the person to tell me a little bit about their story. So if you'll tell me about, your background and what got you into AA and so forth.
Well, I'll go back to I was born into a Southern family of Southern Baptists and Protestants who, when I was hit puberty and my mother converted to Catholicism, and I just kind of trundled off and converted with her because my best friend was a Catholic. In Jackson, Mississippi, and went to Catholic high school and to a Jesuit college. And the Jesuits actually turned me into agnostics to question everything. And early on, I began drinking at age 13, 14, and my earliest experiences with alcohol were not only unmanageable, I came by the end of high school to describe them as unbearable. And part of the insanity of my disease is that even though I never had a social process period of drinking, I kept drinking anyway because it would give me some relief some of the time. I was a very high-functioning, very alienated during high school, but very high-functioning. Stayed away from my very crazy Southern family as much as I could, went off to college and continued functioning at a very high level, but the most important time I had was my 2 to 3 hours of solitary drinking, my alone bar time, where I would sit in a corner by myself and drink copious amounts of beer until I could go home and pass out. And that was what my alcoholism was like. I early on learned that when I drank, my speech was slurred, and I ended up throwing up on my high school prom day. That doesn't get you to first base, much less anything else, So I just accepted that I was going to be a bar drinker. In fact, one of my earliest memories is drinking in a across the railroad tracks bar in Norwood, Ohio, near where Xavier University was, where I went to college in Cincinnati, and watching an old man come in and carefully get that first drink into his mouth. And at 19, I identified and said, that's what I'm going to end up as. After college, I ended up going to Vietnam, which I volunteered to go to as an ROTC officer. And a lot of the motivation was to have Charlie do what I was too chicken to do, to kill me in an honorable and glorious way, And I ended up surviving Vietnam in in 67, 68. Came home to a wife whom I had married on 2 days before I flew to Vietnam because she was pregnant. This was pre-abortion, and I thought that, there was no way I was going to have any kind of a life. Came back, survived. We went on and ended up getting divorced after a second child. I went to graduate school in theater, went to New York to become an actor and a director in the theater. I ended up getting sober instead in 1972. And for that, I'm forever grateful. And a day at a time, I've been gifted with recovery ever since. And the last several years, it has been enhanced immeasurably by the movement that we're creating of secular AA. I'm as excited about it today as I was when I got involved with the young people's movement in New York City in the 70s and became very active in AA. My first decade in the 70s doing the young people's kept me connected into AA, and I got the New York brand of you don't drink, you go to meetings, you help others. And it's always been that way for me. So that and 500 words or less, maybe 1,000 more.
That works well. And, it's very interesting. We have a lot in common. I also come from a Southern family. That's also a little bit crazy. They came from a little town in Florida. And my father was military, and he was in Vietnam in '68. And so Vietnam was always in the background of my life when I was growing up. Yeah. And I also had my first drunk when I was 13 years old. So I guess that's a good sign that something's not going right when you start drinking at 13. So,
it's a clue.
Yeah.
My first drunks was stealing Alta wine and getting sick on it camping out.
Yeah.
14.
Yeah. Well, anyway, so you came into the program in 1972 in New York.
14, yeah.
Okay. What was AA like at that time in New York?
Memory, it's such a fickle thing. But my memory of AA in New York was that it was much more focused on the fellowship, much more focused on meetings and sharing at meetings and connecting with people. There wasn't the kind of dogmatic emphasis that AA has become increasingly in the last 25 to 30 years with the, quote, back to basics movement,
right.
And focusing on the precise directions as they are expounded in the first 164 pages of the Big Book. One of the kind of general things that I've concluded is that in an ironic way, that AA for its first 40 years, roughly up until the time that Bill died in 71, and then for the next several years after, was more open and inclusive than it has devolved to become in the last 35 or 40 years, with this rise of back to basics, simply sober, all of the dogmatic Pacific group, Atlantic group in New York City, kind of emphasis on the working the steps exactly the way it's prescribed in the Big Book. That's just a conclusion I've come to.
At that time, were people, did they make a big deal out of the Big Book? Were they quoting from it? Were they studying it and all that kind of stuff?
There were sections in New York, Manhattan AA that were, for example, Clarence Snyder, the evangelist, the first evangelist of what I call the Back to Basics movement. He had his coterie of people, and
he started the group in Cleveland?
He started the group in Cleveland, the first group to actually define itself as Alcoholics Anonymous. And they broke away from the Oxford group because most of the Cleveland people were Catholics. And back in the 30s, Catholics and Protestants were prescribed against even going to church together. So, and besides, as I think Snyder, Mitchell Kay wrote a biography of Clarence Snyder in which he relates that Snyder mentioned to Dr. Bob, you used the wrong Bible, the Catholic Bible, So Clarence had a very big following in New York of people who would go to his AA meetings the way he did it, and then he had retreats that he gave all throughout he settled in North Carolina initially and then down in Florida, and he was a circuit speaker, one of the first and most popular circuit speakers, and he had his coterie of people who really believed in precisely doing it the way the Oxford group did it, the way he did it. And he was one of the first of the back to basic kind of movement.
That is very interesting. I never really realized that he was the key ingredient to all of that back to basic stuff.
He was one of them.
Yeah.
Also, it included Bill B., who was AA number 3 in Akron.
Really?
Yes. And Henrietta Seiberling,
Yeah.
who, well, she had a strong dislike of Bill and was very judgmental of Bill all throughout her life. And in the 50s, Clarence and Bill D. and Henrietta Seiberling tried to inculcate throughout AA a back to basics movement. But my sense is because of the charismatic cult of personality that Bill had, they weren't able to gain traction. Bill
He was loved by the fellowship. Bill was
loved universally by the fellowship all throughout.
And I guess, okay, so he died like in what, 72, 71?
A year before I came into AA.
And Clarence lived many years after that. Didn't he live like into the 80s?
So I think
19...
sometime in the late 80s.
Yeah, late 80s.
Yeah, 80, somewhere in the mid to late 80s. And he had a lot of influence on those who have now become part of the Back to Basics movement.
That's really interesting. I never really thought about that. I've read Ernest Kurtz's book,
Yeah.
and I read a little bit about Clarence. I need to kind of read through that again. That makes a lot of sense because after Bill died, nothing else is going to be written. Only Bill can read. And then Clarence being like one of the first people in AA, of course people are going to follow him, and people seem to love that. This is the way we did it back then, the good old days, the way it should be done.
There was Clarence, and then another very strong influence during the 80s was the Joe and Charlie tapes.
Yes.
And
now I remember that.
Of the Joe and Charlie tapes. You Google Joe and Charlie, and they have Christian-based rehabs all over the country, or had. They may have gone out of business now. Another influence was that Tom, and I'm blocking on his last name, the gentleman who from New York, who worked with Bill and helped Bill to write the 12 and 12, and also did a lot of work with Bill and writing some of the early pamphlets. He became convinced that only a, quote, Christian way of doing the steps could bring about total recovery. And he and his son, I'm just blocking on his name, they have a all addictions recovery program in East Ridge, New York. And so he was also very influential in kind of cementing the original AA into this very kind of narrow Christian doctrinaire AA that it's become in the last 25 or 30 years throughout much of North America.
I remember Joe and Charlie. I went to a AA thing in Arkansas, and they were doing a seminar there, and I sat through the one on step 4.
Yeah.
And I remember they were a big deal. And I was pretty young in the program, and I didn't know. If I were to see that kind of worshiping of people now, I think I would be a little taken aback. But back then, everybody thought they were wonderful.
Yeah, it's celebrity. Listen, the speaker circuit in AA is all about celebrity as much as about Hollywood is about celebrity.
So it sounds like this was kind of hijacked by the more religious people, and AA was subject to that because we were born from religion. We were born from the Oxford group, and these people are kind of pulling us back there. And there's always been that kind of struggle.
And Ernie Kurtz certainly describes it most effectively, in which he describes the Akron style AA as being back to basics, and the rest of AA as being much more open and inclusive. And the thing about it is that people don't understand that both Bill and Bob went through a process of evolution. They changed. They evolved into the book. And what's not known is that even Dr. Bob, although he's certainly much more identified with the Oxford Christian way of sobriety, Dr. Bob wrote in one of the early AA pamphlets from Akron, in which he said that the Buddhist way of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism could be substituted for the 12 steps. And he even went on to say it might even work better than the 12 steps, that certainly you're not going to hear that anywhere today when you talk about Dr. Bob. You know.
There are some things about Dr. Bob I like, and
absolutely.
like he, the story about the tradition where there's no requirement for membership. You know, it was Dr. Bob. It was a gay person that was coming to the door.
Right.
And it was Dr. Bob who said, no, we're going to let this man in.
What would the master do is what he said.
Right.
And they weren't going to let the gay person in.
Right.
You know.
And then also, I don't think Dr. Bob, and if I remember right from Kurtz's book, he didn't really want the big book to be written, actually. He didn't want a book. He thought that was complicating it.
Yeah, no.
We almost might have been better off without a book.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
So... And the poor guy is stuck in time with the quote that he says where he feels sorry for us atheists. Right. Because that gets quoted at us quite a bit from the...
All the time. And that's not really, I believe in my heart, that's not really what he believed.
No.
And that Bill certainly evolved much more. And he became much more inclusive and even there's some of what has been allowed to be published of his writings from the Grapevine and from his correspondence that he wishes that he could rewrite certain sections of the big book.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
This is something that only I know, and it's hearsay. But during the 80s, I was well acquainted with Nell Wing, the first archivist of AA, who was Bill's personal secretary, both in AA and Lois's secretary after Bill died. And she had in her apartment in Stuyvesant Town in Lower Manhattan 35 boxes, legal-sized boxes of unpublished letters, correspondence, manuscripts, projects that Bill was working on. And she told me that during the last 5 years of her and Bill's life, that they were working on a manuscript, a rewrite of the first 164 pages that would be more broadly and not so Christian Oxford group oriented way. She was a devotee of some of the Greek Stoic philosophers. I can't pronounce the one, yes. And I have been searching for the last 3 years, both at Stepping Stones and at AA archives, and I can find no record of that at all. Mm-hmm. And my darker self, my conspiratorial self, says it's been carefully hidden and expunged, sequestered. But I prove it the way,
Well, it makes sense in a way. I mean, after Bob and Bill passed on, I know that Lois was still alive, and she was getting royalties from the big book.
Yes,
right?
huge royalties.
And Dr. Bob's children, I think, were getting royalties, weren't they?
They got some, I believe, and also, of course, up until until AA let go of the copyright to the first edition.
That's right.
So was Helen Wynne, Bill's last mistress.
That's right.
Just historical fact. And it's so wonderful because we're human beings. Have feet. It's not something to be, oh my God, Bill Wilson was a 13-stepper. He wrote all 13 steps.
Yeah, he was, and I know he's a human being, and that's what makes it great. And some of the people I respect the most in AA are the ones that are honest about their foibles. So yeah, that's very interesting. I kind of side with you that I think that there would be reason for them to want to hide that.
Well, I wrote one of the articles that I wrote for AA Agnostic. And by the way, John, just let me say that I am so pleased and happy that you have stepped up to when Roger came to the point where he needed to move on. That you've stepped up to fill that vacuum. With AA Beyond Belief. But and now I've lost my train of thought. It was that. What were we talking about?
We were talking about that I agreed with you that I think that there was reason for them not to want that to come out to light.
Right, and I know what the point was.
Yeah.
It'll come back or it won't, and that's okay.
Yeah. Well, that's all right. That's, of course, fascinating. So, how did you get involved with the agnostic AA movement? What's the story behind that?
Well, I spent most of my life in and around New York. When my third marriage, yes, that's symptomatic from Vietnam, difficulties with relationship. When my third marriage crashed and burned after 22 years together, I took my half of the house and bought an RV, went on the road, and ended up in Tucson. And about the time that we were invading Iraq, and I made a decision that I could not stay in the country anymore, and I went to Sri Lanka for 2 years as a unarmed civilian peacekeeper in an outfit called Nonviolent Peace Force, and ended up coming back to New York after the stint in Sri Lanka on Long Island, and just continued doing what I had been doing, during the years of the 21st century. In 2009, after the almost meltdown of the economics, I said, it's not a good thing to be on Long Island, which is dependent on daily deliveries of groceries from the mainland, 7 million people or whatever. I'm going to move upstate to Woodstock and start, farming my own vegetable garden, Moved to Woodstock. I never did a vegetable garden, but I met my third wife there, and my fourth wife there, Jill, and we decided to move out to Oregon. We had enough time on the East Coast, and also there's this wonderful little HBO documentary on how to die in Oregon, and I have always been an advocate of me having control over when I die, not the docs or the lawyers. So we picked up bag and baggage and we moved to Oregon, to a lovely, absolutely beautiful little coastal town in southern Oregon. And I'll leave the area unnamed. And we lived there, but we experienced AA as a neo-Nazi, Christian-oriented, fascist cult.
Wow.
And, we had to pick up and move up to Seaside, where we live now, which is within an easy commute of Portland.
Okay.
And about the time that we first became understanding how awful the program of AA, how alien it was to us in where we were in Southern Oregon, I found AA Agnostic online and connected with Roger and started writing articles for him. And I think I've written, some 9 or 10 articles in the last couple of years. And it got me involved in the secular AA movement that has emerged from the delisting of the two groups in Toronto.
Yeah.
Talk about
that.
The law of unintended consequences.
Yeah, that's so funny. I never much paid attention to Toronto, and now it's like it totally changed my life.
It's the mecca of secular recovery.
Yeah. I actually read the Toronto paper to keep up on what's going on up there.
I know.
Anyway, so when did you start the group out there in your area?
It will be, in fact, this coming Sunday, it will be 2 years since Jill and I had the first little meeting in the Ilano Club on 24th Street Northwest in Portland. And when we came to Portland, there was a We Agnostics meeting listed. We came over one Saturday afternoon. There was only one other person there, and it was a woman from Al-Anon who was looking for a meeting without God,
Yeah. And
so we started a meeting. We had at our first meeting 2 years ago this Sunday, myself and 3 or 4 others that Roger had connected us with through the service that he and Chris do in AA Agnostica. And we started from there. And slowly it built up to where now we have 2 groups, actually 3 groups in the Portland area. We've got another group here that has a meeting in Seaside. And we have 6, 7 meetings a week, and more are expanding. And we have 30 to 50 strong members in our secular AA community. And what's so encouraging for me is that they're younger people that are coming in and they're staying who have never experienced, orthodox traditional AA, or if they have, that said, no way can I stay in AA. And
yeah, same here.
I know. They're getting involved in service, and it's wonderful. And we've just barely begun to see how we're going to ripple throughout the AA community.
That's what's so promising. Yeah, we're seeing the same thing. People who intentionally come to our group because they wouldn't go to any other AA group, never been to any other AA group. This is the only experience that they've had. And they come and they are so grateful. It's been helping them. They're getting benefit from it. And it's just been great. So, yeah. So I think this is the future.
I really feel that we are right now, without getting too grandiose, where AA was in 1941 when the Jack Alexander article exploded the AA membership across the country.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
What's ironic, when I was first starting an agnostic group, I thought we might have some problems here in Kansas City, but actually we were totally accepted. And I thought that maybe people would perceive me as a little bit rebellious. But you know what happened? They embraced me, and I've actually become more involved in AA than I've ever been before.
Yes. I just finished a 2-year stint as GSR for the Beyond Belief group in Portland that we started 2 years ago. At the first assembly I went to in February 2 years ago, they ended with the Lord's Prayer. At this last assembly I went to last weekend, they ended with the responsibility declaration. And we were able at that assembly to pass on the motion that we had put in the previous assembly for the Grapevine Book of our stories. And I thought, before last weekend, maybe a 50-50 chance that it would gain the 2/3 majority required for substantial unanimity. It passed, John, with about 90% A's. Maybe less than 10% voted against it. And from where I came from 2 years ago, after the experience in Southern Oregon, I thought it'll never get that amount of changing. And I remembered what I was saying before. One of the articles I wrote was that the tragic flaw in Bill's concept of service is the second tradition.
How's that?
AA's only authority is a loving God as he may reveal himself.
Yeah.
And we know what that's going to be in the majoritarian Christian Oxford group viewpoint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Talk a bit about the history behind the request for the Grapevine Book.
Oh, that history is so sordid. It gives me a lot of effort to despair and to think that AA will never be able to change. And yet it's also a history of the perseverance that when an idea is right, that if dedicated people keep pressing for it, it will eventually come, no pun intended, to light.
Yeah.
The first time it evolved was in 1976, when one of the members on the AA Literature Board of Trustees Committee suggested that we need to have stories of atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers in AA to have available to them. And between 1976 and 2012, or 2014. In 2014, that period of time, it had been voted down by the General Service Conference, in which 2/3 unanimity is required for passage of any issue that comes before it. It never achieved 2/3 unanimity until the very watered down, in our view, pamphlet, Many Paths of Spirituality, which, quite frankly, is somewhat disrespectful. And,
yeah. Was that pamphlet supposed to be like they're throwing us a bone there? Is that they're trying to satisfy us with that?
That's what it is. And again, it came up again in 2012. The issue came up again, and AA collected, as I understand it, some 300 stories from atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers. And when it came to the 2013 conference, it was kicked back again and said, no, this is not what we want. And what we got in 2014 was the Many Paths, which doesn't relate our stories. It does have a couple of very salient quotes that put us on the map of AA, but it doesn't include our stories. It has snippets, sound bites, so to speak, of our stories, to include that a Jewish person has no problem at all saying the Lord's Prayer. That's disrespectful.
It is, because he'd be like one out of millions.
He certainly wouldn't be an Jew.
Yeah. And the atheists they quote in there, I don't really think they were really actually atheists who wrote those things.
I don't. It's the best that can be done. Our issue is not going to go away.
No.
And essentially, AA will either change or it will become, as quaint as horse-drawn carriages in Pennsylvania,
Okay.
Amish country.
And then I remembered, because I got copied on it, or Roger posted it, the letter that came from you and Roger and some people from AA Agnostica that went to the Grapevine requesting it, and it was rejected, but without any explanation.
It was not rejected by the Grapevine. The Board of Trustees decided, no, we will not put it on the agenda for this year.
Gotcha.
And I understand it, because at last year's conference and all this past year, major emphasis has been on increasing subscriptions to the Grapevine and Lavinia. And, they didn't want to alienate their base. I mean, it's a matter of politics. It's a matter of persuasion. It's a matter of the reality of they astutely realized this is not the time to bring this issue up for the Grapevine to produce this book.
And times are changing now pretty quickly.
Yes.
Because I think it probably will be an agenda item with the work that you did and Area 53 in Ohio?
53
they also passed it?
In Ohio, yeah.
So we've got those two delegates that will go to the conference, I guess, and would vote for that.
Requested that it be put on the agenda.
Now tell me this: I need to understand how this works. You've got the General Service Board and you've got the General Service Conference. Do you understand what those?
Well, you've got two sets of trustees: the Grapevine Board of Trustees. You've got the GSO, or the General Service Board trustees. And they run the two corporations, AA World Services, which has its own board, and AA Grapevine, which has its board. And the General Conference is a combination of the staffs of the Grapevine and GSO and all of the delegates that come from in North America, from the number of areas that are in North America and Canada and the USA.
And the General Service Board decides what's going to be on the agenda at the conference.
It's decided, predetermined. Sometime the deadline is September 15th, and sometime in January we'll find out what the agenda is.
Interesting. See, here's what happened in Missouri on this deal, because I was a little bit late getting to the assembly to vote on it, but I went to the last area assembly. And I went to my delegate and I told him what I wanted to do. And at that time I said, I would like to have the entire assembly vote on this to have this recommended, that you vote for it at the General Service Conference. He happens to be the chair of the Grapevine Committee for the General Service Conference. And he told me that it would be better if our area didn't vote on it, because that would allow him to participate in the discussion.
Absolutely.
So he said what he suggested is that I take it to the Grapevine Committee at the area assembly, ask them to recommend it. And I did that, and they voted for it unanimously to ask him. So he said, okay, he's going to go and try to make it an agenda item on the General Service Conference. So is he on the General Service Board? Does he get to decide that?
But see, the way it works is that anyone can write to New York, as last year Roger and I, with Life and Chris and a couple of other people, we wrote to them requesting that this be put on the agenda for last year's conference. So anyone can write in. And if you haven't seen it, I put up on WAFT yesterday, the WAFT Central Coffee Shop, requesting, asking that anyone write in and request that this book be published. Because what Madeline P. discussed at the assembly last weekend is that one of the things that influences what's on the agenda is that when World Services, GSO, gets letters and requests for something from a broad range of people all throughout North America, that alerts them that, hey, this is something that is coming up from the upside down triangle.
Yeah. It's cool to see. I really am beginning to have... I've never been involved in service work until now.
I worked professionally in the field, and I thought it was a two-head issue that I couldn't really work above the group level until now I'm not working in the field anymore,
And every single person that I've met that's been a delegate, I just had nothing but respect for.
They're incredible.
Yeah, and they really are genuinely being of service, and they're listening to the groups.
Yes.
So it's very heartening to see this, and it gives me hope that things can change, because even the people, like I'm from Missouri, and it's it's kind of a red state. There's some people that feel differently than me about a lot of things, but they're very accepting of me. When I was at the area assembly, and the last one I think, or maybe the one before, I was acknowledging I mentioned that our group celebrated its first anniversary, and cheers and applause went up.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's heartening, and also it's something I've noticed, and there seems to be a change with something's going on with Grapevine, because in October of 2016 they're going to have an issue entirely dedicated to agnostics and atheists in AA.
People at the top of our inverted triangle don't get it, and that would be the individual people in the groups, in the GSRs out in the hinterland. The people at the bottom of the inverted triangle, the staff members at Grapevine, the staff members at GSO, people like Phyllis H., who spoke at the Santa Monica conference, Ward Ewing, who spoke at the Santa Monica conference, they get it. They know that AA has got to change from this Christian point of view only and predominantly, or else it will die. Remember,
and it's exactly what Bill warned against before he died.
Exactly what he warned against.
Yeah.
And we have ignored that advice.
Yeah. What do you see when you go to area assembly, and all the GSRs give their group reports? How's your feeling of the general health of AA out there? Are groups saying that they're thriving and growing, or are they saying they're struggling?
It's a little bit of both. I'm going to talk more about my experience of process. When I went to the Pacific Region AA Service Conference, I was amazed at how open and inclusive the level of people working at the area and the delegate, the board of trustees, how inclusive they are. I mean, it just blew.
So at PRASA, because we have something similar to that, because I guess we're in the southwestern region. Okay, so I don't even know what that is. So who goes to that?
Anyone involved in general service work. GSRs, DCMs, area committee members, any AA members can go.
And delegates?
Delegates, yeah.
So is it like, do they do anything that actually goes up through the General Service Conference, or is it like a convention type thing?
It's more like a convention type thing. Okay. And then you've got another branch that are the regional forums, which is something different, and that doesn't, roundups are involved in that too somewhere. It's very complex and very complicated, but what's coming to me is that there are two issues around which the AA as a whole are going to struggle with, in my view, for the next 10, 15, 20 to 25 years. It's the issue of singleness of purpose and the issue of anonymity. That those are two issues that there's still a lot of gray areas of how some are very open about including other people than alcoholics in our meetings. If they have a desire to stop drinking, that's all that's needed. And who can monitor or police whether the desire is real or honest or not? No one.
Exactly.
So if you're in a meeting and you say you have a desire to stop drinking, even if you talk about only drugs, you can't be kicked out.
Right.
But a lot of groups do.
There are some hardcore purists that go crazy about that singleness of purpose thing.
Absolutely insane.
Yeah. And I remember back when I was first in the program, I got in 88.
Yeah.
There were some old timers who were kind of grumpy and saying, "Oh no, you can't talk about drugs" and so forth. But over the years, that kind of dissipated in most of the meetings I went to, and people would regularly introduce themselves as alcoholics and drug addicts, and it was not a big deal. But I know there are some groups.
An underlying issue. And people who were so hardcore about that issue, no drug addicts, that just indicates their ignorance of the Big Book. Because on page 22 of the Big Book, they wrote about people who even use morphine.
Yeah, absolutely. So I can see how that could be a problem. What about the anonymity thing?
The anonymity thing, particularly with the interface of social media. And that, though I certainly agree in principle with the spiritual principle of anonymity and not non-ego, being of selfless service, that in the world, particularly in the world of the 20 teenagers and the 20-somethings, there is no anonymity.
No, there isn't.
They're just open about everything all the time.
Yeah, they are. They certainly are. It's okay.
And on Tommy Rhodes and Recovery 2.0 and some of the other recovery sites, I've heard some very convincing people discuss how for them not to talk publicly about their anonymity, like the mayor in Boston, like the Robert Kennedy's son, the former congressman from Massachusetts. He's saying, I'm being dishonest. I can't be my authentic self if I deny the reality, the truth of who and what I am and why and I am who I am today in recovery.
I saw that documentary, The Anonymous People, I think it was called, and that made a very, very good point, because the anonymity does kind of stigmatize this thing. Still, stigmatizes alcoholism and drug addiction.
It still comes from a place of fear instead of a place of acceptance.
And for a person, nobody wants to hold something back about themselves.
That's right.
I mean, whether you're an atheist and you're holding that back from your family, whether you're gay and you're holding that back from somebody, or whether you're an alcoholic and you're not letting somebody know, it conflicts. People feel conflicted about that.
In a kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't position.
but you can still practice the principle of doing good work for people without having to enact. Yeah. That makes sense to me. I can see that. I agree with that. And especially with the social media thing. I remember there was a vote at our area assembly to put a Facebook page up for our state convention so that people could learn about the state convention on Facebook. Yeah. And they voted it down because they were worried that people were going to compromise their anonymity by liking the page or whatever. And I thought to myself, you should loosen up a little bit on that. It's not that big of a deal on Facebook. Everybody does it anyway.
Well, the reality is that in truth, no one is anonymous today.
No, you can't be. There's actually no privacy anymore.
Even get into the political issue of NSA.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Well, I think this was a pretty good conversation. So, what do you think? Just really quickly, what do you think about the future for AA? Are you optimistic about it at this point?
Optimistic. I'm optimistic for at least as long as I continue being on the planet. That AA will continue in some way, and that it will change and morph eventually, or it will continue the decline that it has. Josie has certainly documented that a lot. How since '93, membership has been steadily on a downward trend.
And I'm optimistic too, and I think that it's well worth saving too. It's a good fellowship. I like it. So,
well, we'll continue working together in concert to make sure it stays around.
Okay. Well, thank you, Thomas. I really enjoyed the conversation. And that's it for another episode of AA Beyond Belief, the podcast. Thank you.